Chapter 3.
After the wedding, no pomp, no lace, we returned to our absurdly small home. A narrow 3-story cottage converted from old stables, with just one room per floor. And there it was, 7 mirrors, shattered. How? No one knew, but the omen was unmistakable. A warning, a fracture, a future. Trying to brighten our new nest, I ventured to Caledonian Market, a London bazaar where one could find absolutely anything. I thought I'd scored a few treasures, and once I decorated to my heart's content, I decided to host a little dinner. Just a few neighbors, nothing grand. We'd barely sat down when one of the guests asked, a little too casually, "Where did you find these curtains?" "Ah, a brilliant find at Caledonian Market," I replied proudly. "They were stolen from me 2 months ago," he answered coldly. And just like that, my great bargain became a scandal. I returned the curtains the next day, tail tucked, dignity dented. While we were still attempting to make a home out of that house, war broke out, the summer of 1914. But even then, even amid such turmoil, my husband seemed to drift like a feather in the breeze. He didn't see war, he saw sky. We fled to Nice, where his family lived. Perhaps I could root myself there. Perhaps something would keep me still. I will never forget that journey. The sky over the Riviera, red like blood. In Nice, we settled in a modest apartment above some gardens, the sea beyond our window. What I remember most, he disappeared. Day after day, I waited. And waited. Eventually, I went to Monte Carlo with the last of our cash. Of course, I lost it all instantly. They returned me to Nice penniless, with only a note that read, "With compliments from the casino." It was then I understood. I would gamble all my life, but never again on a green felt table. The Riviera, back then, was not what it is today. Not yet the summer playground of millionaires, celebrities, and paparazzi. No, in those days it was elegant, winter-bathed, still. I made friends with a group of Filipinos, petite men with impeccable style. Long before Dior coined new look, they were already wearing it. They would visit, cook fragrant, spicy dishes, and we'd spend long evenings in the garden. For a while, I believed in peace. I wouldn't leave Nice for anything. But he wanted to go to New York. And so, we sailed to America, in a small, dark cabin, with no idea what we would do when we arrived. America, that dream of the world. It stirs illusion, ambition, and hope in equal measure. We had barely landed when a reporter approached me, out of nowhere. "I'm from the Brooklyn Eagle," he announced. "What is Brooklyn?" I asked, genuinely confused. I would later learn that Brooklyn was the Cinderella of New York. Just as charming, perhaps, but far less glamorous, and deeply aware of it. We checked into a reputable hotel near Madison Avenue, a so-called decent address. The New York heat was unspeakable. On the first morning, I called for breakfast. When the porter delivered it, I said, politely, "Thank you." He stared at me like I was some kind of stinging insect. "I don't work for thank you," he said. "I work for money." Ah, the tipping system. I hadn't yet learned the dance of dollars. His rudeness offended me deeply, and colored my first impression of the entire country. Later, we moved to the old Brevoort Hotel in the Latin Quarter. The most French place in all New York, more French, in fact, than many hotels in France. There, people were kind. They seemed to understand our struggle. They gave us a lovely room at a modest price. But we were living off my dowry, which, even at the start, had been modest. The money dwindled, and my husband, he floated. He could not adapt. He could not find rhythm in this fierce city. Our tiny room was never meant to be a home. And the Brevoort's residents were refined, proper, and, above all, cautious about reputation. My husband wandered the streets. When we married, he was a vegetarian. He didn't drink. But New York, the rush, the pressure, the endless buzz, it broke him. And that, of course, was only the beginning. That curious episode with Isadora Duncan. In our tiny room, she cast off her garments and began to dance for him, wild and unbridled, a performance for one. I didn't approve of such displays, though perhaps I'd have felt differently if it weren't my husband. Meanwhile, our battle for survival had taken a sharp turn. How were we to pay the endless hotel bills? Neither he nor I, proud and stubborn creatures both, were the type to live off the charity of even the most well-meaning invitations. Then, a rumor reached me, of a wondrous innovation, color cinema. I managed to land a role as an extra in some forgotten film. I truly cannot recall the title, nor the name of the company, only that the studio lights burned so fiercely I was blind for days. It was then the armistice arrived. On November 11th, I leaned from a window to witness the great parade on Fifth Avenue. My vision was still clouded, so I saw nothing, but I drank victory wine all the same. Or at least, I believed in it. My husband, meanwhile, was increasingly surrounded by women in languorous adoration. I was left behind, more and more, alone. And yet, I became pregnant. I found out in Boston, on Charles Street, that miserable, cobbled slope no one can walk comfortably. I returned to the Brevoort Hotel and was promptly confined to bed, living on oysters and ice cream, the cheapest items on the menu, though now they'd be considered indulgent. One evening, lying in the dark, I saw my father. He entered silently, through a closed door, and sat at the foot of the bed. He did not speak. He did not move. His face, pale and still, left me wondering if he was even alive. But in the kingdom of love, all things are possible. Perhaps, in death, a soul is granted one last wish. To appear for a fleeting moment before the one they loved most. He came, I believe, to give me courage. The next day, my husband stopped in briefly, and I told him, my father died yesterday. Later, the telegram came. He had passed at the very moment I'd seen him. I had lost the one person I'd been closest to in all the world. But there was no time to grieve. A greater mystery approached. Birth. My child was already making herself known, and she has never really stopped since. The labor was long, painful. Eventually, they presented me with a rosy, round infant. What? A girl? I exclaimed. But I thought it would be a boy. From that moment on, I adored her. The next day, I asked for clay and sculpted her bust with my own hands, rough and imperfect. I've carried that little sculpture with me ever since, battered by years of travel, but always by my side. At the time, I imagined I'd lived through hard days. But oh, how little I knew of what life still had in store. 10 days after the birth, a new problem arose. Where to live? My husband had vanished. I had no idea where he'd gone. With my newborn in my arms, I hailed a taxi and began going hotel to hotel. Everywhere. No rooms available. In June, in the heat, when people are meant to flee the city? The truth became clear. No one wanted a woman with a crying infant. I left her in the cab and walked into a modest hotel I remembered. By some miracle, they gave me a room. I took the key and rushed back for my child, determined they wouldn't throw me out now. But fate had a sense of humor. My Gogo, so named for her constant bubbling and gurgling, chose this moment to unleash her full voice. Usually sweet, she began to wail, scream, howl. The more I tried to soothe her, the more ferociously she fought. I walked, I rocked, I nursed. Nothing helped. Soon, every phone in the hotel was ringing. Mine too. I didn't dare answer. Eventually, the call came from the manager. Will you please do something about your child? Our guests are complaining. Too late. They couldn't evict me now. Gogo, fed and exhausted, finally fell asleep. The next morning, the manager came up. I have never tried so hard to charm a man, and for such a noble cause. In the end, I softened his heart, and he agreed to move us to a distant room in the tower. From that day forward, every evening after her meal, Gogo slept like a warm, purring kitten. She was gentle, always smiling. I could leave her alone without worry. Those tiny hands moved with such purpose, as if already carving a path through life. But how was I to take her out for walks? I had no stroller, no money for one either. So I bought an orange crate from the grocer down the street. And in that little cradle, Gogo slept in the sunshine, on the fire escape. But I needed work. That's when I met a woman, brilliant, generous, profoundly cultured, who had just arrived in New York from Paris. Madame Picabia, wife of the famed artist and one of the founders of Dada. She was clever, yes, but utterly impractical. She offered to help care for Gogo while I searched for work, and gave me some Parisian lingerie to sell. The trouble was, she had chosen it so poorly we had to part with it for almost nothing. Eventually, I found a modest job with a Wall Street businessman. My task was to monitor a ticker tape machine for stock prices. It didn't last. My price reports had a catastrophic effect on the market, unexpected and quite embarrassing. I tried other jobs. None stuck. Madame Picabia did what she could. But truth be told, we were both hopeless at anything commercial. Then, another woman entered my life, the wife of a powerful publisher. She ran an ultra-modern school in the city and suggested I send Gogo to the countryside, where she cared for the children of her friends. It was time to lift my daughter from her little orange crate and give her something better. 2 weeks later, on a bitter December day, I went to visit her. She lay pale and frozen on a terrace. I was used to suffering, but not for my baby. A small sum arrived from Italy. With it, I placed Gogo in the care of a kind old nurse who lived near Stamford, in a house nestled in the woods. I, in turn, rented a narrow little room in Patchen Place, the famed Greenwich Village courtyard of artists and poets. It could have been Paris, or London. Arched buildings, rows of trees, enchanting. Though my room was so tiny, I had to dress sitting on the bed. Still, I wasn't alone for long. Artists, writers, friends came easily. I hardly remember much from that time, only that it all felt bleak. I was uninterested in everything, except Gogo. She filled my thoughts entirely. Whatever little money I had went to the nanny. I experienced a kind of hunger that scars the spirit. The kind you only forget when you bite into a piece of fruit, or a scrap of sausage. I lost the desire to live. Grew sluggish. But despite it all, I held onto my moral compass. It kept me from seeking comfort in dangerous places. My husband was alive, but where, I hadn't a clue. One night, while walking the streets, a slip of paper flew up from the pavement. I bent down and picked it up. A $20 bill, ownerless. Mine now. I took it as a sign. That night, I treated myself to steak. The next morning, wandering through Greenwich Village, I pondered what to do with what remained of the 20. In a pawnshop window, I spotted a couple of trinkets. Bought them, then walked to the big department stores, where I sold them for twice the price. And just like that, I had made the most successful deal of my life. It was during this period that I met Blanche Hayes, wife of the renowned Arthur Garfield Hayes. A true friendship was born. In their warm, inviting home, I was welcomed among cultured, unpretentious souls. People who offered kindness, and who truly understood. At that time, I met Hanna Walska, a Polish woman of dazzling beauty, driven by an unquenchable ambition. Her husband, a well-known doctor, supported her dream of becoming an opera star. I first saw her at Blanche's house, where I'd been invited to dinner. She appeared at the top of the staircase, dressed in a black gown that hugged her figure like a second skin. Hannah's dream was to sing on the grand stage. She poured every bit of her relentless desire into opera. One day, her husband turned to me and said, "My dear, Hannah has signed a contract. She's off to Cuba to sing Fedora on tour. I can't possibly let my beloved wife travel without an escort. Would you go with her?" "Of course," I replied. The thought of declining a journey to Cuba never even crossed my mind. The newspapers launched the publicity campaign well ahead of our arrival. We were welcomed with great fanfare. Our hotel rooms at the Inglaterra were overflowing with flowers. We barely slept, kept awake each night by the deafening roar of cars skidding wildly across the plaza below. Hannah spent most of her time rehearsing. I wandered the city, determined to learn Spanish. A merry band of young journalists tried to teach me scandalous expressions, bursting with laughter as I unknowingly recited them to stunned onlookers. At the time, the great Pavlova was in Havana, at the height of her fame. Apparently, we looked alike, though I found the comparison dubious. Yet every time I stepped out of the hotel, I was mobbed by photographers mistaking me for her, while Pavlova herself slipped out unnoticed through a secret exit. Then came the fateful night of the Fedora premiere. Flowers were being ordered in bulk, and the audience came ready to be dazzled. But the Cuban public, delightful people, but firm in their tastes, had other plans. The performance was not received kindly. After the first act, the audience stood up and demanded their money back. Desperate, I rushed forward to halt the flower delivery, to urge Hannah to stop, to tell her she was tired, that her voice wasn't at its best. But she refused to be deterred. She insisted on continuing, and so she did, until the uproar became deafening. Flowers crashed to the ground, and chaos erupted. Through a hidden door, I dragged Hannah out, bundled her into a carriage, and ordered the driver to take us 2 hours down the deserted seaside road, to avoid the reporters surely lying in wait at the hotel. When we returned, we found the Italian theater director furious, demanding compensation. He insisted on an astronomical sum, and the funds from New York hadn't arrived yet. In the end, I had to coax a furious Hannah, still reeling from the humiliation, to part with her prized possession, a large black pearl. It was the only way we could leave Cuba on the first departing ship. And yet, despite the scandal, despite the turmoil, I carry a tender memory of Cuba. Of all the Latin American countries I've visited, it holds a special place in my heart. The stern Spanish temperament is softened by wit and laughter. I was endlessly amused by the forbidden plays, the ones respectable women weren't supposed to attend, where actors painted their noses black for comic effect. As for Hannah, she never forgave me. A thoroughly human reaction, she continued to chase her operatic dreams, and soon married a millionaire. The last time I saw my husband was on a Sunday evening, as I stepped out of the little cottage where I had just visited Gogo. We hadn't seen each other in 10 months. As he appeared around the corner, a wave of panic surged through me. The kind I feel when I unexpectedly come face to face with someone I want nothing to do with. At that very moment, a sports car rolled by. The man behind the wheel must have sensed my distress. He opened the door without a word. I jumped in while the car was still moving, leaving my husband frozen on the sidewalk. "Where to?" the driver asked. "To the train station, please," I whispered. On day pray. There, I lived for 2 or 3 weeks in peace. Only the owner's overfed cats were a form of domestic tyranny. And then, I made a strange decision, to learn how to drive. Imagine that. Schiap, who hated anything mechanical, who couldn't even bear using the telephone. Still, I told myself I must overcome that dizzying fear, that strange, physical nausea cars inspired in me. One bright day, I dared to take the wheel myself. Behind the wheel of an ancient Ford I called Lizzie, I set off. Everything went fine, until I turned a corner and came face to face with a giant, locked barn gate. I stepped on the accelerator, fiddled wildly with the starter, and launched us forward. With unprecedented speed for such a venerable vehicle, Lizzie smashed through the gate, scattered terrified cows, exited out the other side, and, pursued by mad livestock, tore through the fields and ended up in a ditch. I understood then and there that I would never learn to drive. It felt like a personal defeat. Driving is meant to give you a sense of freedom, and besides, so many fools do it effortlessly. Not far from my little house, in the woods, lived a young Italian singer, a rising star at the Metropolitan Opera, full of promise. We, being from the same country, quickly became close friends. We took long walks, shared long talks, and found peace in each other's company. We both had that romantic Latin temperament, and didn't concern ourselves with the fact that Mario was in the midst of a divorce. But his ex-wife had been waiting to strike, and strike she did. One quiet evening, as I was having dinner at Mario's house, a commotion erupted outside. Loud pounding, shouts, voices cried, tar and feathers. Mario opened the door, and a group of people stormed into the foyer. There I was, seated by the fire, eating spaghetti. They fell silent. With calm, I rose, cleared the table, and left with my friend. Not a finger was laid on me. I recount this strange little tale because, in its own way, it proves something important. That beneath the layers of modern life, ancient customs still stir in America. Even the biblical kind, like punishment by tar and feathers. And yet, Americans have a curious honesty. Once they're shown they've misjudged, they admit it. A few months later, Mario died suddenly, meningitis. I took care of all the formalities. His former wife never even appeared. Gogo seemed happy, healthy, things had improved, and then, one day, I suddenly saw it. At 15 months old, she could barely walk. She moved more like a crab. Still, the nanny, highly reputable, insisted it was nothing but a lingering cold. But I brought Gogo to a specialist. He looked at me and, without drama, said, "She has infantile paralysis." I felt like Job, struck down, punished. What had I done to deserve this? And then Blanche Hayes stepped in. With her calm, rational, sensible strength, she said, "Why don't you come with me to Paris? I'm inviting you. We'll figure it out there." I had to swallow my pride. We reserved 2 tickets on a ship. But before we left, I went to Washington, to a notary. And there, I changed my daughter's last name to mine, the name of my family. From then on, Gogo would belong to me. Me alone. Before departure, Gogo caught rubella, and we had to delay the journey. By the time we finally set sail, she was lobster red, though the ship's doctor blamed it on a stomach bug. In our tiny cabin, Gogo spent sleepless nights flipping through every illustrated magazine she could find. And by morning, she would appear on deck like a little angel, clutching her beloved giraffe, Torque, to her chest like a lifeline. The old nanny, sobbing, came to say goodbye. It was a heavy parting. She would have followed her beloved child anywhere, but she couldn't come with us. Our ship was painfully slow. But finally, blessedly, we arrived in France. We had made it to Paris. "I've heard of a small, inexpensive hotel near the Madeleine Church," said Madame Hayes. "Shall we try it?" And so we did. But all night, we lay awake, listening to water flushing endlessly through the pipes. No, this would not do. Madame Hayes moved to a more comfortable hotel. As for me, I took Gogo to Madame Picabia's flat on Rue du Petit Champs. Just around the corner from Place Vendôme in the Rue de la Paix. Gabrielle Picabia and I were sitting together, enjoying a splendid breakfast, when suddenly, just outside the open window, Gogo appeared. Flushed, radiant, beaming with joy. "Hello, Paris," she cried, waving grandly at the street below. Then she dashed inside, seized a large goblet of red wine, and drained it in one gulp. We tucked her in moments later. She fell into a deep sleep, the first true rest she'd had in 24 hours. Around that time, I began filing for divorce. The process was unusually swift. No objections, no drama, just silence, and then, freedom. Blanche Hayes found an apartment on the Boulevard Tour Maubourg and invited me to move in with her. I placed Gogo in a small clinic where she received dedicated care. It was a long, difficult road. She fought and wept bitterly at the very sight of the wicked machine they used to treat her. At first, I had trouble with my passport. It was Polish, issued in my husband's name, not mine. My temporary French papers were useless. So I found my old Italian passport, made an appointment with the ambassador, Count Sforza, an old friend of my cousin Attilio, and asked him to renew it. He told me solemnly, "You lost your Italian citizenship the day you married. To extend this passport would be illegal." I happened to glance at the expiration date, 24 hours left. That very day, I rushed to Rome. I requested a new passport under the name Mademoiselle Schiaparelli. They issued it without hesitation. The legality? No one seemed to care. My mother pleaded with me to come live with her. It would have solved all my financial troubles. But I, Shia, having tasted even the smallest drop of freedom, chose flight over comfort. Even if things turned difficult again, I preferred to hold my destiny in my own hands. It wasn't ambition. It wasn't pride. It was a profound need, to be alone, physically and spiritually. That need would shape the course of my life. Back in Paris, I found work. A perceptive antique dealer, sensing both my desperation and my reverence for freedom, invited me to accompany him on buying trips, auctions, antique shops, even small town markets. Gradually, he began letting me select items on his behalf. And so, in time, I acquired a certain eye, a modest expertise. It wasn't hard work, and it left time for Gogo. We took short walks, just long enough for her strength, and, slowly, she fell in love with Paris. One day, we visited Les Invalides. The tomb of Napoleon moved her deeply. "What is it?" she asked, her eyes wide. "How does one explain Napoleon to a 4-year-old child?" I said, "This is where Napoleon lies forever. He was the emperor of the French." She whispered, dreamily, "Is he there, all alone? He must be cold." "No, my darling," I said. "He sleeps there with all his little soldiers." And so, ever since, our letters to each other often end with the phrase, "Napoleon and all his little soldiers." To us, it means love without end. I now lived alone. A 2-story apartment. 2 modest rooms on Rue de l'Université. Friends were kind. I was happy. Alone. I cooked for myself, recreating the dishes our Roman cook used to prepare when I was a girl. The house was falling apart, really, crumbling walls, peeling paint. But the owner was gracious, elderly, almost courtly. He took a gentle interest in my well-being. We rarely met, but through his valet he kept track of my comings and goings. From time to time, he sent small gifts. Bottles of fine red wine, delicacies prepared by his private chef. And I, Schiap, savored the quiet, the solitude, and the taste of independence. It was during this chapter of my life that I met Paul Poiret. I had long admired him. To me, he was the greatest living artist, a true visionary. One day, in the company of a wealthy American friend, I entered a small, radiant townhouse bursting with color. It was Paul's maison in the suburb of Saint-Honoré. And just like that, I had stepped into the world of haute couture. While my friend busied herself selecting gowns, I wandered, spellbound. I tried things on in silence, forgetting completely where I was, losing myself in the magic of it all. There it was, a magnificent coat. Loose and wide, as if made for me alone. Black printed velvet with broad shimmering stripes, lined in vibrant sapphire blue crepe de Chine. "Why not buy it, mademoiselle?" The voice was unmistakable. Paul Poiret himself stood before me, his gaze filled with gentle fire. "It looks as though it were made for you." I blushed. I couldn't. Surely it's too expensive, and where would I even wear it? "Don't trouble yourself with money," he smiled. "You, mademoiselle, you can wear anything, anywhere." And just like that, he gave me the coat. The compliment and the gift, they dazzled me. In my small, dark apartment, that enchanted coat became a beam of celestial light. Soon, a wardrobe began to grow. Poiret continued to gift me exquisite ensembles whenever I needed them. Black embroidered with silver, white stitched in gold. No one ever knew what I might appear in next. At times I was ahead of fashion. Other times, I wore my own things and looked like the awkward sister of myself. One night, Poiret invited me to a farewell fête. He was leaving his charming Saint-Honoré townhouse and opening an ultra-modern fashion house on the Champs-Élysées. There were fireworks. Guests moved between houses carrying flaming torches. The air itself felt like champagne. The new house was dazzling, but like all ideas too vast, too beautiful, it brought him no luck. The centerpiece was a glass room from which Poiret could observe every department. He was a genius, the Leonardo of fashion, unafraid of extravagance. A brilliant couturier, bon vivant, lover of food and fine wine. I remember one lunch in particular, at Chez Elsa, tucked inside the old Paris market. We stayed from noon until long after nightfall, swapping stories over white wine with the head of the Paris Fire Brigade. Poiret's nobility, his fiery enthusiasm, and his disdain for vulgar publicity led him to ruin. Near the end of his life, he lived on 10 francs a day, unemployment assistance. Another dear friend of mine at that time was Jean-Michel Frank. He revolutionized interior design, simplicity, elegance, a kind of quiet luxury that made even kitchens beautiful. He was small, quick-witted, and tortured by a terrible, hopeless sense of inferiority. But above all, above fashion, beauty, and tragedy, I was consumed with worry for Gogo's leg. I sent her to Dr. Pickett, the leading specialist in childhood paralysis. He ran a clinic in Switzerland. Gogo was 6 years old. It was time to decide her nationality. She had choices: Italian, French, American, even Polish. She chose American, and so I took her to the American consulate. She raised her chubby little hand and pledged loyalty to a country that, from that moment on, would be her own. The night before she left for Switzerland, I was woken by her voice. "Mama, where's my papa?" He had already passed, and I did my best to explain what death meant, softly, slowly. There was a long silence. I held my breath, waiting for the next question. And then she whispered, "You know, you're my papa and my mama." And Gogo drifted peacefully to sleep.